Kate Lycett is a senior research fellow at Deakin University with a background in psychology and epidemiology. Her research focuses on creating environments that can wrap around and nurture health and wellbeing, particularly for children and young people. She is the research lead on 3 major projects, including the Breathe Melbourne Citizen Science Project, the Future Health Countdown 2030, and the long-standing Australian Unity Wellbeing Index. So I don't know how she has time to breathe in her day, but welcome, Kate.
Thanks very much, Jackie. It's really lovely to be here in Canberra and see so many familiar faces. I'm really looking forward to the next few days. So today I want to tell you what we've learnt really over 22 years of tracking Australians' subjective wellbeing, but I really want to focus on what we can learn from these data for policy. Sorry, I'll just... Okay, great, we've got that working. So subjective wellbeing, what is it and why does it matter? When we think about a good life, there are really 2 types of resources we need. So there are the objective things, so objective conditions like our physical health and our physical wealth and our natural capital, as we heard this morning, and these things really matter. But there's also our subjective perceptions of our lives, and that's really how we feel about our lives. And these things also matter, and that's the focus of the Australian Unity Wellbeing Index and what I want to talk about today. Subjective wellbeing is really a positive state of mind, and we'll see this as the data that I present today. At the population level, people have a positive outlook and a positive state of mind for their wellbeing. And this is needed as we go about our days when we face those inevitable challenges that happen. So it helps us and protects us get through our day. From a societal perspective, we also need good subjective wellbeing to allow us to participate in society and to have a flourishing society. So the Australian Unity Wellbeing Index has been tracking Australians' wellbeing since 2002 across 40 national cross-sectional surveys, and we're currently just wrapping up in the field this year. Each year we ask 2,000 Australian adults how they're doing. And this sample methodology is really important to us. We do try and get the best robust national sample that we can, and it is geographically and gender representative. These are the measures that we look at. So we have personal wellbeing measures, and we also look at national wellbeing measures. Each year we have a special topic area that's of public interest and interest to the Australian Unity and Deakin team. So for instance, the past few years and throughout the pandemic, we've tracked mental distress. We've also looked at carers last year, climate change, and a range of other things. The other important thing is we track demographics, because looking at subgroups for wellbeing is really the most interesting part of this. So at the national level, we can see we're doing okay, we're doing well, but what's very interesting and where we see more stark differences is at the subgroup level, and I'll talk about this as we go on. So this slide talks about normal range and normative ranges, and for those who aren't statistical people, this isn't interesting. But I did want to put this slide up because it is one of the unique things. When we have over 75,000 Australians who've contributed to these data, it allows us to create national norms. So we can look at these at the individual level and at the average level of the population. And I will show you some slides today that have normal ranges on them. And when we look outside the normal range, this is where we can see some interesting patterns in the population. And sometimes this is where there's reason for concern. So what is the Personal Wellbeing Index? Well, that's the most robust measure that we track. It has a wealth of theoretical literature behind it. It's recommended by the OECD, the WHO, and it's used all around the world. It looks at 7 life domains. So these are the 7 life domains that matter to people's overall life satisfaction. I want to reflect on key things that we learn, we see year in, year out on the survey, and instead of going through all the data, I just wanted to summarise in the start, because if you look at every report, up until quite recently around COVID, and I'll talk about that because we did see some striking differences, These are themes that we see year in, year out, and I think as policymakers, we really need to learn from these and try and not just recognise them, but actually implement action to make a difference. So the first thing is that people who are unemployed have very low levels of subjective wellbeing, below the normal range. This is also seen in low-income households, people who are single parents, and in people who are divorced. So these are subgroups that we know we can target to try and improve wellbeing. The next is variation by age. And traditionally, we've always talked about a U-shape. So as we go through life, we see a dip around middle age, which we've often attributed to other things, having many demands in middle age. I can certainly feel this with 3 children. Mortgages, jobs, all those things, often caring for aging parents. We sometimes call it the sandwich generation. So this is a time when we've traditionally seen a dip coming from young adulthood and then rising in later life. And sometimes we refer to that as the golden years. I'll come back to this because this is changing. But if we look at the cumulative data, this is what we see in the AU data. The other thing that's really robust is this idea of the golden triangle. So of those 7 life domains that we look at in the Personal Wellbeing Index, there's 3 that really matter. So that is standard of living, achieving in life, sometimes referred to as a sense of purpose in life, and good personal relationships. So year in, year out, what we do is we look at how all 7 domains regress onto overall life satisfaction. And these 3 variables account for about 90% of the variance. So if you really want to boost people's wellbeing, these are the 3 domains that we can focus on from a policy level. Now, I want to just take you through some data. So my wonderful research fellow is overseas. So these graphs are taken from other places and they're not all consistent, but bear with me. On the y-axis here, we have strength of satisfaction, and this is a percentage point out of 0 to 100. And across the bottom on the x-axis, we have the years. Now, this is Personal Wellbeing Index over the 22 years that we've been tracking it. And what you'll immediately see is its remarkable stability. And this has been commented on. Why would we look at subjective wellbeing? It's so stable. What's it going to tell policymakers? Well, yes, at the population level it is. And what I want to flag here is even in 2020, which I thought I had marked up, but that's okay. Even in 2020 there, you see that there is a rise in subjective wellbeing. Now, this is not what we were expecting. We were almost expecting what we would call homeostatic defeat. We were expecting to see lots of people's wellbeing suffer during the height of the pandemic. But we didn't see that. And on this graph, I know it's very messy, but we also have all the 7 domains that we've been tracking along with the overall index. And what you can see in 2020 is that we actually saw a rise in all of these domains. So this is something I do just want to touch on. I know I have touched on it previously in other presentations, but I think it is really worth doing. And notably, the 3 that we see, actually, we saw some of the highest levels on record with standard of living, personal safety, and health. When we look at the National Wellbeing Index, which we haven't really focused on in many of our reports over the years, and that's something I'm really interested in trying to promote more, and I'll talk about that at the end. But we look at these 6 domains of life satisfaction. So how satisfied are people with, for instance, the economic situation in Australia? And we create the National Wellbeing Index here. So again, excuse the graph, very busy. Black line here is the National Wellbeing Index over time. The red line is government, which is a huge amount of variability in that. But everything else, this seems to be tracking okay. And what I want to just point out here is, once again, we see rises. In fact, National Wellbeing Index had hit an all-time record high in 2020. So things like economic situation and social conditions hit an all-time high. So I think this is a lesson for government of what can happen when you do have good policy. I just want to reflect, and this slide is taken from Greg Jericho's work from the Australian Institute. It's not mine, so just declaring that, but I loved it. I think it really shows us just how nicely what happened to single people who were on unemployment benefits during COVID. So in 2020, you can see that they were brought above the poverty line. So what did we see? At the same time, we were tracking Australian subjective wellbeing. So this graph here, I really want to focus on the red bars, the bright red bars in 2020. And this graph is looking at wellbeing by occupation. And I really want to focus on the unemployed group. So when I came onto the project 4 years ago, if I went back through the previous surveys, this group almost has levels of subjective wellbeing that are in under 50 is like pathological, sometimes clinical depression range. So these people are not doing well. And that's just been kind of what we've tracked and reported every year. But in 2020, we saw a 9 percentage point boost, so a huge boost. We also saw this trend across single parent households and also in low income groups. So here we have income groups on the bottom and strengths of satisfaction on the PWI on the y-axis. And what you can see is the red bars here in the middle in these two low income groups, they rose. And this is quite a large group of people, so they did rise by quite a bit. And it was certainly a substantial, meaningful rise. So what happened post-COVID? Well, a lot. So this is 22 and 23. So we had the hottest year on record. We have a huge cost of living crisis, 13 interest rate rises in a row. We have the war in Ukraine, and we also had the referendum in Australia. So there was a lot going on, and the floods, of course. So what did we see overall? And these next two graphs are just they're not looking at the indexes. I just wanted to also give you a flavour for the one item measures, which is how satisfied are you with your life as a whole, for instance, this question is. And this is what's reported in most surveys around the world, for instance, in the OECD and other surveys that only have room for one item. But what you can see here, I'm not sure if you can see the yellow shading in the box, but there's the normal range here. And for the first time in 2022 and 2023, this has fallen below the normal range. So the answer is of how satisfied Australians are, it's hit an all-time low. When we look at how satisfied they are with life in Australia, we see exactly the same pattern. So we've hit an all-time low, coming off a peak in 2020. What is really interesting in the recent data, and these graphs are a little bit different, so, well, quite similar, but this is gross household income, and on the y-axis we have strengths of satisfaction with the Personal Wellbeing Index and income groups at the bottom. So in the previous graphs you would have seen that for income, people, for instance, on an income of 61 to 100,000 at a household level were doing pretty well, definitely within the normal range. What you can see now is they are below the normal range, and this is significant. This is basically showing us that people who were financially doing okay are no longer. And I think if we think about the cost of living crisis, this is obvious. A median income household in Australia of 93,000 in 2023, I think. So this is a lot of people, and I think this is what we're seeing and why we're seeing one of the big declines in subjective wellbeing. When we look at age, I mentioned the U-shape, no more. This is the 2023 data, but we saw a very similar pattern emerging in 2022, where we almost see a cliff. So those under age 55 have subjective wellbeing levels on the PWI that are below or close to the bottom of the normative range. And this is really significant. It's half of the population. And if we think about who interest rates are hitting and all those things, the financial things that are hitting people, these are the groups that are struggling. There are, of course, people in older generations that are also struggling, but at the population, this is the overall average. I also just want to flag some of the recent trends in terms of, or patterns in terms of intergenerational data that we're seeing. So you can see that this is feelings of anxiety. I mentioned we've been tracking mental distress. It's actually a really strong feature of the Australian Unity data, given that Australia has such a lack of measuring psychological health at the population level. These data are really valuable. So we have stress, feelings of stress, depression and anxiety, and I could have shown you any of those graphs and we see exactly the same pattern. So it's the group under age 35 who are really struggling. And this is climate change worry, which we measured in 2022. And once again, it's the young people who are really worried and feeling it. So from these graphs, I really just wanted to show you that not only is it the income and age subjective wellbeing, it's really young people. If we could be targeting that, we could really boost their wellbeing. So what are the lessons for policymakers from this? Lift people out of poverty now. If we want to boost subjective wellbeing, we saw it in COVID. It was like this amazing intervention trial that we couldn't have done from an ethical point of view, and we did it. So let's stop talking about it and let's do it. Number 2, focus on the golden triangle domains. I've talked a lot about the financial aspect, but we also know that personal relationships and a sense of purpose matter. And these are things we can have policies around to try and help build these things in our society. Target policies towards people with low subjective wellbeing if we want to boost the overall national wellbeing. So people on low incomes, help them. Single parent households, these are groups that we know we need to buffer and promote wellbeing in. And finally, target young adults. Young adults are struggling on many fronts, and they face many challenges. And this is really important from an intergenerational perspective. These people are going to have families and children soon. And I recently was talking about our data with someone, and they said, oh, but Kate, this generation, they're going to inherit so much. They're going to inherit the most money that they've ever had from older people. Well, yes, some people are, but inequitably, and a lot of people aren't. So we really need as a country to try and wrap around and support these young people, and not with, a small break-in HECS for 1 year or whatever, that. It actually needs to be really strong targeted policy if we're going to make a difference. And I really strongly believe that we need to do this now, and it needs to be, if we are going to make that difference, before we have these intergenerational issues. I want to also just finish on some future directions in the last 2 minutes. So I'll just quickly run through these just to kind of show you some of the new things that we're taking on with the Australian Unity Wellbeing Index. So this year we are changing our methodology. One of the really hallmarks of the study has been trying to get the most robust national sample we can. We've been doing caddy interviews where we would cold call. We used to get about a 35 to 40% number of people answering. It's dropped below 20%. And of course, if you think about how many phone calls you get, lots of the population aren't answering these calls. So we're moving online with the Social Research Centre with the Life in Australia probability-based sample. So we're really excited about that. This gives us an opportunity to look at demographics in more detail, so to know who's actually on government benefits, to know how big people's mortgages are, and to know more about family composition, how old children are, and all those things. So I think it's a really exciting time. This year we're also doing the caddy survey so we can compare methods, and we'll be publishing all of that. Last time I presented at this conference 2 years ago, I mentioned the idea of a data dashboard. I'm really pleased to say that this is a reality, and we're working on this at the moment with the Australian Unity team. So all of the data over the past 22 years is publicly available. It's quite hard to access. It's not a good data dictionary. So we're really trying to bring it into things like HILDA and the longitudinal study of Australian children. So you can go and you can download the data. We often get requests from government or organisations to do analyses for them. So with this, you'll be able to go online and download the data yourself, which is really exciting. And this is just a quick snapshot of the data dashboard. Another exciting thing that we're doing is, I came onto this project 4 years ago, and the PWI was developed a long time ago, 20 years. There's been lots of reliability and validity checks throughout that time. But I often get asked when I do media on the index, for instance, what do these domains mean to people? So we've actually been doing a lot of qualitative work, and I just wanted to flag this one because this one bothers me a lot. This is the National Wellbeing Index, and it's where we ask people how satisfied they are with the state of the natural environment. And I think it fits with many of the discussions we'll be talking about today in terms of the environment space. So what we see here is that, surprisingly, when we ask people how satisfied they are, it's in the middle of the normative range. It's not shifting. Despite the hottest year on record, people seem to be generally quite satisfied. So we really want to understand, well, what are people thinking about when we ask them about the state of the environment? And this is just an example of some of the qual data. Very preliminary, we're still working on it for all of the domains. But this just really did give me a bit of a sense of maybe what we're seeing. So we do see a mix. So we see things like beautiful parks, nature and things. So just kind of watch this space, and there'll be more to come on that. I need to finish by thanking the entire Australian Unity team. Maddie and Jeremy have flown up for this, and there's many other Australian Unity people here, Adam and Siobhan, who'll be presenting. And the Deakin team. I was just really lucky to take over this project. There's a long list of people before me, and I need to acknowledge Professor Bob Cummins, who was the founder of the project with the AU team. Thanks very much for the presentation. I'm here for the 3 days and look forward to catching up. Thanks.